Good morning, welcome back into this. It's so wonderful to be back in this beautiful, beautiful Jean Nouvel building. I always think DA must be so proud of this building. You must be so proud of it.
We love it to bits.
Yeah. So the World Health Organization declared COVID a virus, a crisis of international emergency in January 2020. They declared it a pandemic in March 2020, so 18 months ago. And over that time, there's been an enormous number of studies of all the different metrics, numbers of jobs lost, numbers of business failures, numbers of cancelled events, and so on and so on. And I read those with a sort of deepening sense of gloom in the spring. And it seemed to me that what we needed in our businesses actually wasn't that. It was things about what we can learn from it, how we can gain some advantage from the horrific experience that we've been through in the last 18 months. So the piece of work that I've done, that it's just published this week, and you've been sent a link to it, and actually the original online version has got a marvellous picture of a hideously claustrophobic theatre in quarantine from New York on the cover. That's the original online version. And I did it from April to August this year, so I finished it in August. And I say that because this is a kind of moving target. I mean, the minute I'd finished the text, new things came in, some of them reinforced my impression, some of them contradicted them. So it's just a moment in time, it's a snapshot, it's a moment in time. And things will look different in 6 months' time, so we will look back on this and some of our conclusions we will think were right, some of our conclusions we will want to modify and change. But what I wanted to do was look, and this is for, I think, all of us, the most profound period of disorientation and discontinuity in our lifetimes. It's global in a way that even world wars haven't been global. It's been the most extraordinary experience for all of us. And I wanted not just to add to the pile of studies about disasters, but to find lessons from it, to find things we were forced to do and to change that seem good things and things that we might want to retain and want to continue. And so my piece is written very much through that lens. So I'll very briefly, I mean, it's 70 pages odd, but if you want a quick read, the summary at the beginning and the what's next at the end gives you all the bones of it. And I will just summarize very quickly in 5 minutes or so what it contains. And then I will ask 1 or 2 questions and have some discussions with David and Tatjana. David, or you have the titles there and you have the bios online. And then after about half an hour or so, I will be really interested to hear from you and hear not tales of disasters, which I'm sure is the last thing you want, but the things that for you were interesting learnings in this, the things that for you, you did differently in the last 18 months and you thought, this is good, we should go on working like this. So it's not divided like this in the report, but I'm going to divide the very quick list of headlines into the things that were internal and the things that were external. And the internal things, that one of the commonest things because I did this study globally, that's the other thing I should say, that almost all the other studies were either art form based or they were country based. I did this, it's all art forms and it's global. So it's got a good range of stuff to draw on. And in a lot of companies, it was very clear that there was a very harsh light shone on company culture. And the companies that didn't have supportive cultures, non-hierarchical cultures, empathetic cultures, often came really badly unstuck in the last 18 months. And the companies that did have good cultures are very much the ones that have found a way through it. I mean, this is too obvious to need to say, but the whole approach to creating business strategy, I think people have thought in the last 18 months that the old traditional one where you get the last business strategy out, you update the numbers and that's your new business strategy, can't work in the future. There's a wonderful quote in the New York Times that I put in my piece from the guy who runs Cirque du Soleil, the great Montreal-based international theatre industry. And he was being asked why they didn't foresee some of this stuff. And he said, look, we do business modelling all the time. But we never did business modelling that assumed we would lose 100% of our revenue. I mean, you don't. Why would you do that? So our whole approach to business strategy, I think, is going to have to change. Operational, this is very interesting. A lot of the smaller companies had more operational flexibility, versatility. They were quicker on their feet. And some of the smaller companies found routes through this that the bigger companies struggled with. And I think there's a lesson in that for some of the bigger companies in terms of how they structure their operations in future. Crisis management, I mean, again, there were some companies that could quite comfortably find a way through dealing with crisis management, dealing with the communications that involves. And there were others where they were completely traumatized by it, almost a kind of frozen immobility. And I think that we should think about crisis management all the time. I mean, it may not be another pandemic, but your building may burn down. Or there are all kinds of, there may be a volcano in Iceland. There are all kinds of crises that affect us, and we should just be comfortable with crises. And we should just be comfortable with stopping doing all the normal things we're doing and focusing on a crisis. And I think this has really taught us that. I think there's a very profound issue for us in the last 18 months about risk. And that's only partly from the pandemic. It's from social media, it's from disinformation, it's from QAnon, it's from all these sort of tidal wave, it's almost a tsunami of they call it post-truth. I mean, I would call it untruth, of distorted views of the world. And so the pandemic has caught us at a tricky moment because it's caught us just as we're wrestling with these kind of very complicated relationships with truth. And what is truth? Does truth matter? 10 years ago, we thought truth mattered, and now there are people who think it doesn't. And I think what that means is for the future, we've got to be very careful to get back to a rational relationship with risk. And that's been disturbed in the last 18 months, and we have to get back to it. Digital, I'm sure we'll talk about digital, but that's the explosion of digital. And what seems to be important there is so many companies have hurtled into digital very quickly. They've learnt, by the minute. I mean, you've seen literally every week that goes by, you see people's digital results getting better, getting more polished, more confident. And my slight worry about this is that we'll rush to the end of this, and then they won't go back over that stuff and evaluate it. And I think that's really important. I'm all the time looking at other people's digital online things and thinking, that's good. That doesn't quite work. We could do that. And so I think this has been a very precious 18 months experiment with moving into the online sphere. And we shouldn't move on from it without evaluating carefully the experience. And the last thing I'd say about internal things is it's such a common thing that people say in cultural organizations, particularly the larger ones, that it would be wonderful if it wasn't for all these silos, these organizational barriers. This department doesn't talk to that department, and da-da-da. And, it's a very, very common thing. Now, in the last 18 months, a lot of those silos have been demolished because it just hasn't been possible to you can't manage a crisis and be siloed. It doesn't work. You have to have quicker and more immediate communications between departments, more informality, more quicker decision-making. And it's, to me, really important that we retain that we do not go back to those terrible hermetic silos. So those are the internal things. Externally, it's been very interesting to see how many organizations who were previously thought of themselves as competitors have been collaborators in the last 18 months. There's an English phrase, if you're in a ship, any port in a storm, if a storm strikes, you don't think what port you're going into, you just go to a port. And there's been a little bit of that about the pandemic, that people, and particularly interestingly, formed collaborations between large companies and small companies. And again, a lot of the smaller companies had route through this that the larger companies struggled immediately to find. And again, I think that's really important for the future. This spirit of friendship and collaboration right across the industry is important. I think this is, people, people close buildings for refurbishment, all kinds of reasons, for refurbishment and refitting, and, 2-3 months, 6 months is a long closure. 18 months is an extraordinary closure. And I think there's a slight danger in assuming that we just reopen it as if we closed for Christmas or closed for the summer holidays. During this 18 months, we've changed, but during this 18 months, audiences have changed, and society has changed, and communities have changed, and the audiences we try and bring back after all this aren't going to be quite the same audiences that we think we knew 18 months ago. So there's an awful lot of issues around audiences, about finding new kinds of dialogue with our communities that are less transactional, perhaps more profound, because there is a lot of American research, particularly now, that communities want more profound relationships. There's a slight sense of frustration with a very simple, superficial transactionality, if I can call it that. It is interesting that online consumers, that quite a proportion of online consumers are not the people who were previously your live consumers. And that's quite interesting, that the pandemic has brought into your orbit quite a lot of consumers who are new to you. Why weren't they consumers of yours before? Why are they going to enrich your live public? Or are they an online public that you will need to continue to relate to after you're open? But it is quite an interesting fact, that, I think. There's still, more in North America perhaps than in Europe, but in North America there's still quite a lot of fear in the public about being back indoors, going back in numbers. I feel it less here. Interestingly, I came here through Schiphol yesterday. Everybody was wearing masks. I arrived in Copenhagen, nobody wearing masks. And it is, in every country almost in Europe, it's different. But in America, and there's some slightly worrying research very recently from Wolf Brown, the great American researchers, that actually things are going backwards rather than forward at the moment in America. Levels of fear are starting to go back up again. And the inventory on sale is gradually increased, but the sales are stagnating. So, I think it's less true for us in Europe, but it's a real issue in North America, I think. So we shouldn't too easily assume. You can maybe in Denmark assume that fear has gone away. But, you will be, a lot of people will be trading in other communities. Southeast Asia, parts of it have gone away, but in North America, it hasn't yet. And the last two things, the touring is, there are all kinds of reasons why touring, I think, has to change. There were all the pressures of climate change. There are all the issues of Brexit. There are all the, yes, absolutely. I constantly say to I describe myself now, I'm living back in that small island away from France, but I always describe myself as a European, not a Brit. But all kinds of things, I think, mean that the pattern, our relationship with touring as an industry are going to change. And I write quite a bit about that in my report. I won't repeat it now. And then the last lesson, which is a really interesting one, I think, is what it's taught us. I analysed in some detail the reactions of pandemics all around the world from governments. And what is interesting is that what this has revealed is governments have very different levels and depths of real understanding of the cultural and creative industries. So in some countries, they are very, Germany, I think, understands it very profoundly, I suspect. I think Italy probably does. There are some countries where the understanding is quite profound. And interestingly, only 56 countries in the world, of the 100 and whatever the many there are, only 56 have ministries of culture. The US doesn't have a ministry of culture, interestingly. So some countries, immediately we went into the pandemic, you could see from their responses that they really understood the needs of the cultural community. Not just the needs, but what the cultural community could give back. Because a lot of the time during the pandemic, the cultural and creative industries have been giving back into the community, but just different things from what they would usually give. But there have been countries where you saw straight away, Brazil, India, where the governments had no idea how to react in terms of the cultural community at all. And I think I avoid the word lobbying in my report because I think it's a slightly charged and loaded word, but that's actually what I'm saying, although I don't use the word. We have got to get better, I think, in a lot of countries, and I could include the UK in this, at helping the government really understand. A third of workers in our industries globally, a third, are what I call semi-detached workers. They're freelance, they're contract workers, they're non-full-time payroll staff. That's an amazing structural thing about our industry. And there are all kinds of, certainly in the UK, all those people fell through the government nets in the early days and got no financial support. So I think we can't wait until, because they always say about friends, the moment to try to get friends, the wrong moment to do it is when you need friends. You have to build circles of friends not when you need them. And we shouldn't wait for the next crisis to be educating our governments about our sector. We should do it right now. We should start thinking how we help our governments understand how our sector works. So, as I say, it's sort of 70-odd pages, but you'll get, if you just read the summary, it's 4 pages or so, and it'll give you the flavour of it. So I'll just talk a little bit with David and Tatjana about particular things, and then I'll absolutely want to hear what your experiences have been in the last 18 months. I mean, David, I always think I had the privilege to be chair of David's organisation for a while, and I've been on the board for a long time, and I think I always feel it is a kind of gold standard, ISPA, for cultural leadership. It lovely talks about itself not as a marketplace for content, but a marketplace for ideas. And you must have really seen this around the world in the last 18 months. You know, how have leaders reacted? And where do you think the examples of good leadership have been in this journey? And if first you can identify those, you may not want to identify the other ones, which are where are the leaders, where has leadership conspicuously failed? You probably don't want to identify that group.
Well, anyway, thank you, Anthony, and thank you to Athol and the Planning Committee for inviting me here, and good morning to everyone. It's great to be here. One of the things that really struck me about Anthony's paper is it's a learning document. It's a forward-looking document. And I think this is so important right now because, we hear so many people talking about going back to normal or the new normal. I think the word normal is literally an anachronism. I don't think that exists anymore. And, with respect to cultural leadership, I wouldn't say there's particular regions that I've seen, have excelled particularly. But I think it's been organizations and individuals. And I think, for me, the key words today about effective leadership are empathy, humility, adaptability, flexibility, flattening organizations to have a greater sort of team participation in the leadership. I think those have been the organizations I've seen that have really been exceeding and coming together more as teams as opposed to hierarchies. We have a very, very small office at ISPA. It's only 5 of us, but I don't think we've ever coalesced as much as a team as we have now. And we've seen that in a lot of organizations.
I mean, my general sense, and maybe it's not surprising, is that the larger organizations, which are typically more sclerotic in terms of their structures, have found this all harder. And it seems to me that a lot of we understood how good the leadership of some small organizations is, how really good it is, and how there isn't all your things, I really agree with every word about that. I agree with both the thing about normal, about not wanting to get back to normal, and also I agree about the business of empathy. Do you think it's a general principle that the larger companies have struggled more with this, or do you see a kind of different divide?
I think the challenge, well, on both ends of the spectrum, organizations that had let go of a lot of staff or laid off a lot of staff was problematic. I think the remote working for a lot of people has been really challenging. There's a very large institution and organization somewhere in the States, I won't be too specific, and the challenge that they really grappled with is they brought back the advancement or the development, the fundraising teams first, but didn't bring any of the artistic team in, didn't bring the production teams in. So there's this real maybe an interpretation of what was really valued in the organization. It wasn't the work going on stage, it was the money coming in the door. And I think we saw that, I saw that in a number of organizations, literally around the world. And I think that was really challenging about how we prioritized, different teams in large organizations. So that's kind of my immediate reflection on that.
I mean, I think there's a slight danger that there will be a whole industry of people in a few months telling us how to deal with crises built on the experience of COVID. The next crisis will be different. So I think what we need to be good at is being very flexible about dealing with crises, not a particular crisis, but just the whole business of how you reorient a management team if you're dealing with a crisis. Managing in a crisis is a different kind of management to others. Touring, I mean, do you see, in a way we were already, because of climate concerns, we were already probably starting to get squeamish about the city hopping old touring model with huge numbers of people. But I think this has accentuated that. Is that what you seeing that?
Yeah, very much. I mean, we talked a little bit about this in the session yesterday, and it's certainly, well, particularly for ISPA members. I mean, international collaboration is kind of everyone's sort of calling card almost. But I think also there's a real feeling, particularly in the United States, where xenophobia has, had such an incredible rise that cultural touring, the cultural interaction, the global exchange is the way we're going to get out of that again. So it's been interesting. There's two groups have kind of formed in the States, but this discussion is happening everywhere. But one of them is called IPC. It's the Independent Presenting Commons, and the other is CIPA. I don't remember what the acronym means, but it's essentially independent creative producers coming together. And both groups, what they're really talking about is, first of all, as a sector, how do we work together? I think the first thing would bring the two groups together, but that's another conversation. But, so how do we work on contracting? I think we're talking about that later today, in fact. But, getting rid or, looking at a more reasonable way for exclusivity clauses. Longer engagement periods, residencies. We talked extensively about that yesterday. Having an exchange that isn't, one night in New York, one night in the Midwest, and then one night in LA, or similarly, jumping around Europe. Thinking so often seeing companies, I remember being in Australia and artists being there for a 3-night gig, coming from Canada. It's just, it's, well, not sustainable. So I think there's a lot of ways also for organizations to collaborate more closely. In terms of, I don't want to say group booking, but looking, putting together more sustainable touring models. And that's a conversation that's starting to happen. But I think the real challenge right now also is the whole sector speaking, the artists, the artist managers, the independent producers and the institutions and the presenters. I think that's how we'll really come up with something. But to my point earlier about normal, we're already seeing people just slide right back to the old model. And I don't think that's going to be the way forward. There is so much learning we've had over the past 18 months. The earlier panel, we touched on this briefly, but a real issue I'm seeing a lot of, both in Canada and the States, are just the discussions around equity. Within the model, and not simply having a pay-to-play model. Diversity, which we touched on briefly earlier, inclusion. And, that's with respect to the artists, it's respect to our communities, our audiences. So I think I really see this, I'm not Pollyanna, but I really do see this as a real opportunity, because we peeled away a lot of what was kind of lying beneath the surface in our sector. So I'm quite optimistic.
Mm-hmm. I really agree with that. I'm often accused of being an optimist. I'm not an optimist. I'm a rational positivist, which is quite different. But in this respect, I do agree. There's that terrible business thing about don't waste a good crisis. If we get through this 18 months or 2 years, and we aren't better at doing our jobs, and we haven't learnt valuable stuff. Because there's always, in every organization, every institution, there are some things that should have been killed years ago, things you should have stopped doing, but there was some reason you couldn't. There was a stakeholder, there was someone on your board, there was someone in your management, there was some very particular institutional, like ball and chain, that stopped you getting rid of this or getting rid of that. This is the moment. There will never be a moment like this to move on and to shed those things that every organization has things that we know we should have shed years ago. Tatjana, I'm really thrilled to have you with us, because We will all have had experiences as consumers of online activity, but you've really been, at the front end of it here. And I'd be really interested to know what your takeaway from it is about, obviously it'd be interesting to know how you did it, but what did you find really worked? What were the things that you end this period thinking, we could mainstream that? Mm. And what, perhaps also it'd be interesting to know, are there things you tried that didn't work?
Yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, that's also how we evolved. And of course, I'll say I speak from a very privileged situation. We are part of the media. That's in our DNA. As a radio orchestra, we do nothing that is not broadcast and made available for everybody to, at least to listen to and often also to see. But of course, and I would say during these 18 months, I think there's been only 5 concerts that we have missed. Otherwise, we have made concerts every Thursday online. So we had a lot of experience in the beginning, but we also had, I would say, first of all, for our TV productions, which we share everywhere on YouTube and where else we can. We made very luxurious productions. They are really high class and usually a big crane and 3 to 4 cameras on stage and in the audience, and they're really super to look at. But they're also quite expensive, which means that we could only do a few every season. We have robot cameras in the hall, but they cannot interact with a real ordinary TV camera because the quality is a little different. So we spent these months where we kept on making televised chamber music concerts when we didn't have the orchestra, otherwise we made it on. And the way we worked about the production quality, we actually ended up with a very smooth technique where we could do this with only 2 people instead of 8. Time is money, which means also that we could do quite a lot more productions. And we have now online, it was just posted, I think, 2 weeks ago. It is, believe it or not, it's a contemporary concerto for harp by a young, very talented Danish composer. And it's I think it's reached over 13,000 views right now. For contemporary music, that's quite good. But if you look at the production they have made, and I really urge you to do it. It's fantastic because they have clipped up the view in 3. So you have one long where you can see all the orchestra, and then 2 small inserts where you all the time can shift between different instruments. So you really have this live feeling that you're walking around in the orchestra, but it's really made with very immobile robot cameras. So that was one thing we learned, how to...
So what didn't work? Almost everything worked.
Yeah, no, but the first productions with the robot cameras, that didn't work. And I cannot urge you to see it because we took it down.
Oh!
No, it was simply too lousy. And this is not to sound brutal, but we also, in the beginning, when we got the orchestra back again, we made small sessions in this studio with people from our strings and said, okay, come and do something. And they came full of life and did Prokofiev duo and things like that, which was good, but it didn't have that message that people at that time really needed. It was something that you already know, already do, put it on. And it was just sort of filmed a little bit like I'm being filmed now. It doesn't have that production value. That means that when you see it sitting alone home, wanting to share with somebody, it was so much from here and bye over there. It didn't have that connection, so that didn't work. Can I?
Go on. No,
it's okay.
No, I'll just say one very quick story. The Stratford Festival in Ontario, in Canada, which has got, it ran some video stuff during the summer, and the whole business of how the online audience engages with a stream show is a really important thing. How do you what sort of interactivity can you introduce? And they did an amazing production by Robert Lepage of Coriolanus, Shakespeare's Coriolanus. And it was such a complicated multimedia thing that when you saw it live in the theatre, your sense of what was real and what was virtual and what was filmed was lost in 5 minutes. Within 5 minutes, you had no idea whether you were watching images or holograms or live actors. And so they during the pandemic, they put this out as a relay. And they had a watch night party, so there was stuff in the chat field. And really interestingly, a lot of the people who'd done the technology for it were watching the stream. And so all the way through, there was a kind of parallel universe of, how did you do this? And how did that work? And the technicians answering it. And it gave the online audience a sense of being engaged in this in a completely different way to anything you could do in a live venue. The idea, I was going to ask you one other important thing, because in a way, all the things you're describing, I mean, they're Rolls-Royce, they're gold standard, they're amazing. And I've seen them, they are really terrific. And there will be a lot of people I know thinking, oh my God, we haven't got that sort of money, we haven't got the DR resources. My sense is that prices have come tumbling down, and the quality, the resolution quality of visual imagery has gone up and up and up. And I think audience expectations have gone up. But I'd be interested in your perspective on this. Does high quality mean high cost? Always?
Not necessarily. I mean, that was what we came to when we really worked on it. It did take a lot of time to get to that point where we are now. It did take a lot of wasted efforts as well. But I think what we learned now, and that I think this will change the way that we work forward forever, is that you can actually really achieve a lot of things, but it needs the brain and the visual ability to see how can you make the screen be more three-dimensional instead of being just a flat thing that needs to be pimped up all the time.
One of the most riveting pieces of theatre I saw all through the lockdown was, and that's why it's the cover of my report, was a project called Theatre in Quarantine, done by one actor in New York City. And he had a cupboard in his flat. He had a very small apartment, and he had a cupboard in it, just an ordinary clothes cupboard. And he painted the inside of it white, and he put his iPhone on a tripod, and he experimented with all kinds of ways of doing things as an actor in this space. So it's the smallest stage you can imagine in the universe. And it's absolutely riveting. And he did it with an iPhone, and he did it with a simple, it cost a can of paint for the cupboard, and it cost him almost nothing. And there's a very good, I think, a New Yorker piece called The Story of Theatre in Quarantine, which explains how it was all done. But I always give that example when people say, oh, I haven't got all the money to do online stuff. It's much more about imagination than it's about cash. David, yes, and then let's I'm really interested to hear, there's a question I'm really interested to hear from IAMA members, which you can be thinking about this while David talks, is what does this mean for the cultural market? I mean, we heard a little bit this morning about this very, very long spectrum now between massively paid leading figures and people really struggling on very, very small fees at the other end, and the problem with some of the contractual frameworks we use. And I'd be really interested to hear, particularly from agent members, where you see this going. Are we going to have a more rational and a more humane and a more collaborative kind of commercial marketplace in 2 years' time? I hope, or not. But David.
I was just reflecting, listening to Tatjana. We have a program called Pitch New Works, and it's an opportunity for artists to basically pitch our membership on work that's in development. And we've done 3 iterations online since the beginning of the pandemic. And what's been fascinating is to see the trajectory the work has gone through, and artists coming in with purpose-built online projects. And to your point, Anthony, one of the ones I found the most interesting was an artist built in gaming into the theater piece. So taking something that's already, is an online platform and building it into the piece to create a greater level of interaction. And, that kind of innovation and vision is so exciting to see, again, an opportunity. But I'll go back to Anthony's question.
We have 20 minutes, so I'm going to leave both of you with questions to be thinking about. I'll come back to you in the last 5 minutes with one question. Of all the pandemonium of the last 18 months, what are the 2 things that you most hope will be different in 2 years' time as a result of the experience we've gone through? So I'll come back to you at the end for that. So, experiences that people have had, questions, comments, disagreements with what we've said. Yes?
Can you hear me? I'll try that mic.
I think you need the mic for the recording, that's the thing.
Hi, hello, yes, Caroline Phillips. I'd be very curious to know if other agents have had a similar experience to mine, in that some of my artists, having been deprived of work but having had more time at home with their family, now want more time at home with their family and are actually turning down quite lucrative engagements, saying that actually their values are, I'm going to modify my lifestyle so we don't need those big fees and I don't have to be away for long periods of time in expensive European cities. It's rather painful for the agent to have to deal with, but I have to respect those kind of decisions from some of my artists.
That's really interesting, and it's a cousin of two things, isn't it? It's a cousin of the touring conversation, and it's a cousin of the whole working from home issue, which is so live in management at the moment. You know,
Yeah.
are going to people, you know, there seems to be a general sense that a lot of offices will come back 3 days a week, something like that. But it's it's really interesting to hear that artists are expressing in a way the same.
Yeah,
changed needs.
Could I just add another sort of coda to that, is that the kind of contracts we're being presented with are much more unattractive and asymmetrical against the artist's interests. My take is that with a great panic around the force majeure clauses and when they did and didn't apply, the lot of promoters have had the lawyers in, at vast expense no doubt, who've gone through their entire contracts and introduced all sorts of really very onerous things. And I'm having to say to artists, I cannot advise you to sign certain contracts which basically put them at risk of penalties for indemnity type penalties, whilst being very unprotected against cancellation from the other side. So I think these two things together are leading quite a lot of artists to turn down engagements which in the past they certainly wouldn't have done.
Some of those will be try-ons, won't they? Some of them, they'll be half expecting the artist to cross that clause out and send it back. I love Boris. I love Boris saying this morning that he's now started reading contracts again. But it's true. I think we're going to pay, one of the things is we're going to pay a lot more attention to the I'll call the small print, but the details of contracts. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay. Hello, Sonia Epping and Symphony Orchestra. I'm afraid I didn't get the whole discussion, so I might refer to a point that has been discussed. But, you know, we all did, you know, streaming radio, like the colleague of Danish radio, of course, a lot over the pandemic times. And the one thing I think is we need to solve when we go on doing more and more online, multimedia, cross-media projects, is we have to sort out the problems with the big labels. Because that was discussions we had on and on and on. And we all get in more and more problems, who gets which rights to broadcast, to put online. That is a big issue. I think that, you know, you all know the discussions with DG, if we have an artist, or from Sony, and this. And, well, that is a discussion to be had, I think, in the future, if we want to, you know, really do the streaming and online things in our more and more in our daily life.
And the whole, I agree, and the whole issue of geo-blocking of streams. That it's not so much true in classical music, maybe, but certainly in commercial music and in some, there are whole territories that are blocked out of what are supposed to be global streams. I'm sorry, David reminded me, and I should have said this, but before you speak, if you could just simply say who you are, the organisation you're from. So you are... Caroline Phillips, yes. Yeah, sorry, you said. Okay, yes.
Kirsten Dawes, Pure Bolessal, also promoter and artistic planning, and also leading into what Sonia said, there's the issue, of course, of artists' rights, but the huge issue that we face all the time is we produce a lot of newer music. That means we're putting things out there at massive cost, it's publisher costs, basically, and we're cutting down on streaming times because we can't afford to keep things online because of the publisher costs. And at the same time, that then plays into the whole question of what do we do about pay models for online streaming? Because I also think more and more there's been a lot of talk about culture should not be free to consume. On the other hand, our learning from this whole thing has very much been that the things that work best have a slightly educative role. They're things that people can really engage with. It's not just a straight-streamed concert. It's a new piece with a discussion around it and so on. And how do you do that sustainably if you're paying massive rights to the CD companies, you're paying massive rights to the publishers, and you're earning nothing while you're doing that?
There are two, no, that's a really good point. There are two big sort of elephants in the room, if you like, about online. One is monetization, and the other is discoverability. How do you promote to an audience of 10 billion people, potentially? I think that what this may force people to do, and a publisher, all the people who are in the rights chain, rights holders, rights creators, publishers, this will force them, I think, into a fresh approach, because some of the old models both ways don't work. I mean, the very avaricious models don't work, but the free models may not work either. So there's going to have to be some sensible ground found in the middle. Now, I mean, there's nobody from a publisher here, is there? It would be really interesting to know.
Yeah, there is.
Yeah, right. So how do you see this?
Thank you. Max van Aulok Ricordi.
Thank you very much for stepping up.
I know we're a pain in the ass. But you're used to work basically with PD material. So you're used to not pay anything in a broader sense, playing music which is out of copyright since ages, decades, hundreds of years. So within the pandemic, the income from the streaming was very, very important for us publishers. But I totally agree that we have to remodel the fees for synchronization, for videos online, for streamings. That's correct. But we have to do that together.
And in a way, kind of reassuringly, this is a very standard, ordinary, common situation in any market. In any market, you have a chain, you have a production chain and a consumption chain. And if any one place in that chain is disproportionately avaricious, the chain collapses. That's just basic economics. So in a way, we're not facing a problem that's conceptually different to other industries. It just has a very particular issue. It looks different in our industry, but it's the same problem. You have to have a chain from the creation of a product right through to the consumption of the product, where the value added down the chain delivers something that works for everybody. And I don't know your industry well enough to know where is your IAMA, where is your ISFA, where are the global bodies that are helping all your colleagues around the world begin to come to terms with this, because it's a changed world for sure. Yes. Will you just guys jump in if you want to jump in? Sure. Yeah.
I'm Gunther Broeke, Brussels Philharmonic. Thank you, Anthony, for this wonderful piece of work, which I haven't read yet thoroughly, but which I will do. And when I'm walking around and talking to people and also listening to you, I think we should construct a monument for COVID. We can put it in Wuhan, because all of the questions we ask ourselves, did we need COVID to address those? Do we need COVID to question touring? Do we need COVID to question the structure of an orchestra which hasn't changed since the 19th century? So I really think that we should wake up. And now there is one little thing that I kind of disagree. I think we should go back to normal as fast as possible, because we missed it dearly. But we should not forget, and we should reassess all the questions that we are raising now, because if we don't do that seriously and in depth, we will be back to normal and to the 19th century, and we will find ourselves killed in action with the next crisis.
And I think, actually, you're taking your argument backwards. If we do look, the way this piece of work is dedicated to the notion that we should all be learning lessons. This is a precious experience. And if we do learn these lessons, I'm with David on this, I think the old normal was broken in all kinds of ways. We kind of always knew that. And I think perhaps there's an argument for having an alternate years, a pandemic, an Icelandic volcano. A pandemic, an Icelandic volcano. You know, the things that will completely disrupt our industry. Oh, no. Okay, moving quickly on. These guys have got 5 minutes to go on thinking about my 2 questions. So. Yes.
Magnus Still from Still Art, Finland. I'm thinking how what you just said, and you followed up that we are seeing. We knew that things were broken before, and now we could see it so much, or at least for me, this was a big wake up. Those things that I knew didn't work, the vulnerabilities of our industry, the people that were vulnerable, and the very unfair structures that existed. I was aware of them, but I have never seen them this dramatically as I have seen in the last 18 months. And now we go ahead, and I would also like a monument for COVID-19, so I would remember what this is. How do we continue? That's really what's on my mind. How do we not just... I like to go back to normal, and I think this discussion about are we going back to normal or not, that is a very difficult question because we haven't defined what normal is and what's not normal. So it's not really meaningful before we define it. But somehow I long back to normal, but in the same time I would like to take it seriously what we have been experiencing and how do we proceed now. We know about the problems. What do we do with this? That's really a big question mark in my brain.
No, I agree. It's interesting, isn't it? That there was a kind of waves of responses. So when it first happened, I remember in March 2020, writing a report from my board in Canada telling them that it would be possible to stage a festival live in June 2020. In March 2020, it looked like that. So in the early days, it looked as if this would be terrible but short. Then there was a period it would be terrible but longer, but everybody said, but we'll soon get back to normal. Then about the fall last year, I would say sort of September-ish 20, we began to see the phrase, the new normal. And that was a different normal, is to Gunther's point. And I think, I'm beginning to think now, we've got to be careful about this. It's not a new normal that throws everything else away. So I kind of think it's a kind of enhanced normal. It's an old normal with the additional overlay of the good new things we've learnt in the last 18 months. Like, to David's very first point, the importance of decent human values in running businesses, empathy, honesty, transparency, all those kind of basic things that every business should have, but they didn't all. So I've thought maybe there's a sort of enhanced normal rather than a new normal. Right, you got 2.5 minutes thinking. So there's one more. Yes.
Helen Sykes artist. Apologies for mentioning the B word, but it had certain implications for our country. And interestingly, COVID has helped to obscure some of the problems that Brexit has caused on the touring front. Quite sincerely, we need not to forget those issues. However, what's interested me this past year has been, within my particular field, which is opera and concert singers, first of all, an upsurge of conversations amongst agents through Zoom who would never have spoken to each other in a dressing room before, not necessarily from this constituency, but from a much wider constituency, which I found extremely encouraging, and it has produced new relationships and possible collaborations. What worries me is the occurrence of what I call parallel conversations between disparate groups, even within that constituency. And are we all actually pulling in the right direction when it comes to the issues of the dreaded force majeure or media rights in contracts? How can we somehow centralise our discussions and our conclusions and our wishes in a way that refines the input of time that has been invested so far? I don't know the answer, I'm just raising the spectre at the moment.
No, one of the answers is here in this room. I mean, one of the answers is groups of people who are wrestling with these problems to coming together. I mean, I said to Athol last night, you are, I think, one of the very first cultural conferences that I'm aware of that is back all live in real time. And I think this is, it's brilliant that you're all here. And I think one of the answers is that we have to talk to one another and we have to share our experience of the last 18 months. And I think that, the forum with the good gaps between sessions for people to have coffee conversations, I would think you will all go home from this period in this wonderful city with some very fresh thinking about some of these issues. And I'm sure of that. Right, 5 minutes. So remind them what the questions were. What are the 2 things that you hope in 2 years' time will be different and better than they were before we went into this situation? No, Tatjana, you're first. Don't look at David.
The 2 things that I hope are better. Yes. No, I was hoping to elude that question because when I hear all of us talk now, I think there's one thing that really, for me, emerged out of all this. It's the constant reminder of what's really driving us, and that is the love together. And I cannot say how much the orchestra has missed to have an audience. They played after the second wave, when they came back, they played without an audience in the hall. They were so miserable. They really couldn't.
Did they have a sense that there was an audience out there?
Yeah, because it was live broadcast.
No,
so,
but I mean, did they feel that? Did they feel there was still some communicating going on?
Yes, they tried to, but it wasn't in an empty hall. I was the only audience allowed. We love each other, but not that much. And I would say when the audience came back, for the first of them, the sheer joy they had to be together in the hall and hear that music live. So I think for me, it's very important that we have learned how to communicate wider digitally. But we must not forget how important it is to experience the live music and to be in the same room. And I think we have been better, and I'm pretty sure that this is also something that will stay with us and be even better in 2 years' time. We've been better to communicate with our audience. We've been better to explain what we are actually doing, and they have understood that in a moment of crisis, this is not just being wonderful, velvety sound, but it's actually something that means it and has a world to say to them. And I would say when we opened in August, we opened with Mahler 2. It could not have been more significant for people. Mm-hmm. And when we had to turn a lot of people down because we had to slim down the audiences, some people simply called us and cried and said, "You cannot do this to us. This is the moment that we need to hear this." And the understanding between us that what we had to communicate meant the world to them, and they would give us the importance of doing this back to us. It was just so beautiful, and I think that will stay with us for a very, very long time and determine the acts we are doing.
No, I really agree. We haven't talked much about audiences in this session. Maybe you will in other sessions, but that whole business of the audience being hungry for something deeper than simply a transaction, I think that is going to be a really important thing coming out of this time. So, David.
I think you changed the question, but anyways, I'll move forward. I think the first thing for me, actually, I'd go back to Helen's point, that 2 years from now, we are speaking as a sector, across regions, across roles in the sector, and are coming up with common solutions. I think it will be through organizations such as this and ISPA and various other organizations around the world, but I think it is a starting spot. The second thing, I think one of the things we really saw throughout this, you mentioned the response of government. And while it did very much from region to region, I think in many, if not most regions, culture was at the bottom of the response. And if we can use this as an opportunity to really affect stronger cultural policy in our various regions and globally, so that, particularly in an industry that relies so much on independent workers, that it is addressed in some way. So those would probably be my 2 things.
I think that's true, that culture is at the bottom of most ladders in most of the time. And I think this has really taught us that we have to help it's a better word than lobbying. We have to help our governments understand our sector better, and so much will come from that. David, thank you so much. Tatjana, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I would leave you with in a way, to pick up on something that David said. I think that, for me, it goes back to something I said earlier, this business of, in this terrible time, people, I mean, it's great to have somebody, from one of the publishers here, that we have realized what an integrated industry this actually is. And very particular specialisms are built up. The specialism of being an arts manager, the specialism of running an opera house, the specialism of running a museum, the specialism of being a broadcaster, of being a publisher. And they have slightly not drifted apart, they've become more and more specialized at what they do. And I think what this 18 months has reminded us is that we are all completely interdependent. And I think the more we can go into the future carrying that truth in our hand, it'll help deal with the issue of the online value chain as well. All these sort of issues, particularly the money issues, will get easier if we recognize that we're completely interdependent and none of our parts of this industry would exist without all the other parts. So thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Atol, for inviting me, and thank you for this gorgeous building that we're in. Thank you very much. And it's 12:30.